Building a vocabulary of arpeggios that you can use when you're soloing on a chord is like having a set of very flexible licks that you can improvise with freely. Each arpeggio will have a certain melody and a certain color on top of the chord. In this video, I'm going to show you 25 arpeggios that all work really well on a basic G7 chord, and I'm also going to cover how you can make some lines with them so you can hear how they sound. My name is Jens Larsen, learn jazz, make music. And of course I'm gonna throw in some honest opinions on avoid notes and which arpeggios I think work and which I don't think work, so that you have something to disagree with in the comment section. This video is essentially just a huge collection of arpeggios that sound great on a G7, and I'm using a really plain old G7. There are no nasty alterations or sharp 11s, it's all pretty basic. Of course, if you want to see a video on maybe an altered G7, then let me know about that in the comments. First, let's just start with the basic arpeggios, so the 7th chord arpeggios. And I'm of course going to include the arpeggio from the chord itself, but also some of the other diatonic 7th chords. And that's mainly just because these are sort of the building blocks of jazz harmony. They are the arpeggios that you probably already know and already use. So we have the arpeggio of the chord itself, G7. Of course also the arpeggio from the 3rd, the B half diminished. From the 5th, the D minor 7. I'm also using the arpeggio from the 7th, so F major 7. And there's one more arpeggio that actually contains an entire G major triad, and that works as well, so that's an E minor 7 arpeggio. And putting these arpeggios to use in some lines would sound like this. If you think in terms of avoid notes, then including the D minor 7 and the F major 7 on top of the G7, which both have the note C in there, would maybe seem like a strange choice. But in fact, if you look at the melodies that you end up making with these arpeggios, then it's not so weird, because most of the time, if you use the D minor 7, so here the C is really at the top, and you would be playing, but then the natural place to go with that would be to resolve this and really treat the C as a suspension of the 3rd. And melodically, that's actually a very strong melody to use, and that's also why it's very common and why we often use it like this. For the F major 7, there we have the C as well, but it's sort of buried in the middle of the arpeggio. And in that way, it's just easy to use anyway, and we don't really hear that it's clashing against the 3rd. That's also why it's the favorite arpeggio of George Benson and Charlie Parker. Besides checking out the arpeggios and learning some new options, then it's also a really good exercise, if you know most of them, to just go through all 25 and try to write a line with each of them. That's really gonna push you in terms of figuring out what you can do and how good you are at coming up with material and using that in your solos. The next obvious set of arpeggios that we should check out before we get into some of the more exotic structures would be the triads. And actually that's pretty simple to figure out what triads will work with our G7 chord. Because if we take the arpeggio of the G7 chord, so G, B, D and F, then we can just add the diatonic thirds around that. So if we start 2 thirds below, that would be C, then we would have this C, E, G, B, D, F, A and C. And then we can start picking out triads there. So that means that we have E minor, G major, B diminished, D minor, F major. And again, of course, you have to be a little bit careful with the F major triad, because that C needs to go down to a B, or at least to be treated melodically in a way so it makes sense. But for the rest, these are all triads that work really well, and you can use them in examples like this. To me, the Sus4 Triads are a little bit sort of an overlooked gem when it comes to checking out stuff within the major scale. And that's simply because I really like the melody that they have. So you have that 4th interval and the 2nd interval. And that's just a very nice sound. If we look at what is available for our G7, then we get these Sus4 Triads. And from these triads, then the ones that I prefer to use would be the A sus4, the B diminished sus4, the D sus4, and the E sus4. And you could probably get other ones to work as well. I think this is sort of becoming a little bit a matter of taste and also a matter of your habits when it comes to playing. But using these 4 in lines would sound like this. You should notice that the B diminished sus4 is in fact the opening statement of Joe Henderson's Inner Urge. And that can be a good inspiration, especially if you're improvising over a longer stretch of G7 in a more modal setting. You could look at the triads as being just the 7th chords where you're leaving out one note. Whether it's the root or the 7th you're leaving out, that's a little bit up to you, but that's why they work. It's really just the same set of notes. It's just a part of the notes that we're using. And the same goes for another set of arpeggios or voicings that we can also construct in that way, and those are the Shell-voicings. So Shell-voicings would be the 7th chords, but then we're leaving out the 5th. In that case, we can just use the same arpeggios as what we did with the 7th chords. That means that we have G7, B half diminished, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7. And using them in some lines would sound like this. As you probably already know, then Quartal arpeggios are in fact just inversions of Sus4 triads. So that means if you have a G sus4 like this, then if I take the D down an octave, then I get the Quartal arpeggio from D. But I'm still including them as a separate section, even though I'm not really working with inversions for the rest. And that's simply just because if you use them as a melody, then they have such a different sound from the Sus4 triads. And they're also really a huge part of especially modal jazz. So they're well worth checking out and having in your vocabulary. In order to explore what Quartal arpeggios we have available, then the best place to start is probably just to look at all the diatonic Quartal voicings in the scale. So for the middle string set, that would be this. Of these options, then I tend to use the one from E, the one from F, which is also of course the upper part of a G13 that you probably already know, then the one from A, and the one from B. A great sound to grab the attention of the listener is to use quintal arpeggios. So quintal arpeggios are stacks of fifth intervals, and of course they have a really large range. So this kind of sound. Now it's a little bit difficult to use these. They work really well if you put them in the beginning of a line, and they also work better if they're really closely related to the chord, simply because you have this large range, so you kind of want to have chord tones at the lower end of a melody like that. So in this video I'm only using 2 quintal arpeggios on the G7. I'm using the one from the root, so this, and then the one from the fifth. And that's because the one from the third, that's this sound. And that's not a really useful sound for a line, because you kind of want to have those perfect fifth intervals for this to work. It sounds a little bit sort of like a signal. Using these arpeggios in a line would sound something like this. Now that you know a lot of options for a G7 chord, so essentially just any 5 chord, then maybe you also want to check out a 2 chord, so a D minor 7 in the key of C. And I have a video where I'm going over 25 arpeggios for that chord. And actually there are quite some different things to take into consideration once you start working with the 2 chord. So that in itself is also a little bit interesting. You can check out that video here.